Thank you, Dr. Grace, for meeting with me today. You
Bachelor.
have a bachelor's. You worked as a research scientist for almost 5 years, and then you went back to get your PhD,
Imagine, yes.
and now you're doing a postdoc.
Yeah.
So can you walk me through your journey? At what point in each part did you know, okay, this is going to be my next step? Or did you always know from the beginning, this is going to be my trajectory?
No, I did not know from the beginning about any trajectory. Which I think is both an asset and also a weakness, in that I have not been very strategic in my career journey so far. It has been very much I follow my curiosity and I follow like the opportunities that are available to me, and that is really what I follow, not strategy, which again is a blessing and a curse at the same time. But with regard to my work in my process in bachelor, so I went to school at this small college in Maryland called McDaniel College, and when I landed, I knew I was pre-med, because at the time I was still thinking, okay, we are going to medical school, that's what we're here to do. Then I took a molecular biology class, and I was just so fascinated by this idea of molecules and how they work in the cell, and how do scientists know this? How do they know what is happening? How do they determine what these molecules are doing? How can we harness this to understand disease? I think that was when I was exposed to and was truly, I think that was probably the point at which my trajectory changed. And I remember I went to my professor and I told her, I really like this subject. This is my favorite thing, of all my being here. I'm so excited. And I think she was really receptive to that, which I'm so grateful for. And so this was my sophomore year. Then now my junior year, she said, you know what, you can come work in my lab because you're so interested and excited. I have this project I just started that I think you'd be a great fit for. And that was the project that was my senior thesis. And in that process, I was exposed to molecular cloning. I was exposed to this idea that we can understand about different molecules and how they are related to disease. That was the first time where I was like, oh my gosh. Because the cool thing, it was a very small college. My graduating class, I think, had 30 people, which is crazy compared to UT, And so I think it was a gift because it was just so small, and the teachers paid attention to you. They knew who you are. They would call you if you're absent from classes. So it's it was this little bubble. And so I think for me, that really just allowed me to just explore curiosity. So I got to kind of do this really big piece of the project, and it was so fun and exciting. And so then now, while I was in this junior year, I was like, okay, this is the job. But I'm still kind of interested in medical school, because that had been the story I told myself forever. Yeah. So I was like, okay, we are still going to medical school, but in the meantime, let's just do this science thing. So then now it was time to come home for the summer, and I was like, okay, I can't just sit at home, because at the time I didn't have a work permit because I was on a visa, and my parents didn't see the need to have us work because they wanted us to focus on school, and I was privileged in that regard. So then I knew when I came to UT that I couldn't work because I didn't have the permit, but I was like, but I'm still gonna do bench research. So I sat there. I remember looking back, I'm just like, what the heck? But I sat down and I went to the UT directory, and I took a list of 30 professors, and I wrote them this mass email. I mass emailed them all. I think I'm gonna look back now and just look at them and just be like, what the heck was I doing? But why did I mass email them? And I told them, my name is Grace.
All of them were in the same email.
I don't remember. I think I VCC.
Okay.
But actually, I'd have to look. Or maybe what I did is I wrote them all down and then I just copied one by one.
Okay.
Either that or blind. I knew not to mass email, actually. Yes, at least I didn't. But I sat down and I sent them this email, and I was like, let me tell you, my name is Grace, and I've been doing this research, and these are the classes I've taken, and I'm home for the summer. I can't work, so you don't have to pay me, but I want to learn how to experiment. So that's what I sent these people who they had never seen me. Here I was from Maryland, and now looking back, I'm like, but here I was, and I was like, these people, they're doing because all I knew was molecular biology, because we're working with molecules and it's biology. So I was like, people that do molecular biology at UT Austin. And then I found the department website, and I was like, okay, 30 people. And I just wrote down the names and I emailed them. And then of all of them, one of them responded. Actually, 4 of them responded, and they said, we don't have money, or we don't have the resources, because it takes human resources to train a whole undergrad. So what I know is that you have to have a grad student who's like, okay, I'm going to train this random person. Okay. And then because it's the summer, it's okay. I don't want to say waste of time because that's bad, but it's like it's time that you may not get back because the student is only with you for 3 months.
Yes.
And then they're going to go. So you're hoping that in those 3 months you train this person
And they get something done for you.
Get something done for you, and then they go. That's what you're hoping. But there's no guarantee because it's like 3 months. 3 months is how long it takes to train someone.
Yeah.
So now looking back, I'm like, oh my gosh, this was like literally the hand of God. I don't know. It was like so much luck and providence, I think. But anyway, so of all those people, I think 5 of them wrote back and said they didn't have the resources. One of them said he thought he might have the resources possibly, but to please call him to make sure that I wasn't crazy. And looking back, I was like, why would he tell this to myself, to like an undergrad? But anyway, so I called him because I was like, how dare he think I am not crazy? Which looking back, I think I was a bit crazy because who is emailing professors randomly and saying that you're going to work for free?
And you were not even in the college.
I was not even, not only that, I wasn't even in the state. Looking back, I'm just like, what in the world? Because here I am, literally, and I looked back and it's from like my McDaniel email. Like, so even that is, because now I know that professors, like, they typically interact with like other professors in terms of collaboration, you know? They don't just respond to random strangers. So now here I am. And so then I was like, okay, I'm going to get on this phone call and I'm going to talk to this professor and tell him what I'm doing and why he should hire me. And so I did. So then I remember he was like, okay, so Tuesday, whatever the date was, he gave me it. And I called and I talked to him and I told him why I needed to learn about like his research. He's a virologist and he studies, you know, molecular biology of all these different viruses and trying to understand how they work and all of their secrets. And I was like, yes, this is where I'm going to work. And he was really gracious. And he was like, I think now looking back, I really truly think he was just like, what the heck? But he's also, I think, one cool thing about many scientists that I have learned is that they're very like open-minded to some things. I think that they will try different things. I think the job requires you to be a bit open-minded. Yeah. So anyway, so I think he was just like, okay, so now this one. I mean, he had a graduate student who was interested in training. So he was like, okay, we'll train her. And so they put me on a project and I got to come home, and the whole summer I was at UT working in a lab. You could not catch me without pay. You could not catch me. Like, I'm telling you, I was like, you people, you do not understand. And I remember my parents were just like, I guess this is great. ? Like, but I mean, they were like, she's happy, she's learning, this is good for her resume. Yeah. And at the time I was like really still thinking about medical school. So at the time I was also like volunteering at St. David's, and I would walk from lab to St. David's and back. And like, I was just really excited about like all of this, which looking back, I'm just like, what in the world? But yeah, so I did that. So that was my exposure to UT, and that's how I got here. And so then I went back now to college after that summer, and I was like, this is for sure what we're doing. I don't know this medical school and this is exactly what we're doing. So then I went back, I did my final year, and I was committed to this idea that I would be a scientist and a doctor, possibly. And then I did the last year, and then now the same professor hired me on as a research assistant. So now I had a job. So the idea that now I had like a job with healthcare benefits and retirement, again, you couldn't catch me, because I was like, okay, now we have a job, we're going to save, and then we're going to apply to medical school, and it's all going to work. And that was my college experience.
You must have really seen something in you in those 3 months that he hired you as a research.
I'm telling you, I was like so hyped. And I was like, you guys, this is the coolest thing you can imagine. And you know, honestly, at the time, it had never occurred to me that I could do bench work as a job until I started working with Dr. Parish, who was the professor at McDaniel. And I realized, oh my gosh, this is a job. And then here I found out that there was a whole lab of people who this is what they were doing. At the time, I didn't understand the concept of graduate school, but I knew there were people who were being paid to do experiments. And I knew there was a supervisor who was supervising these experiments. And I was like, this is the life. What more could you possibly want in this life? Keep in mind, I wasn't being paid, but I mean, the next semester or the next summer, I was paid. So at that point, I was like, okay, here now there is a job with a salary. It has retirement. It has health benefits. What more could you possibly want in this life? So yeah, that was my entry into youth.
So then, why did you decide you needed a PhD?
So what's wild is I didn't think I needed a PhD because it never occurred to me. Like, I think when I was actually thinking about this interview, I was like, you know, it never occurred to me that I needed to go to school, because as far as I was concerned, I had a job doing a cool thing I liked. It had retirement and healthcare. what else do I need now? With like, what possibly? And what happened actually is, after that summer, the professor then ran out of funds, because now I know that like professors, they have different types of funds. So some funds you can have for like an assistant, but it's for a certain time period.
Yeah.
And what happened is that he didn't have any funds for the school year. It was just for the summer. So I had to now find another job, which I did also at UT. So I remember at the time thinking, this is great, like this is fantastic. And I worked now in this new lab for 2 years, helping a graduate student and a postdoc. And also in that context, I didn't understand what else I could possibly need, right? Because it's like a job. And I did that now for about 5 years in total. But I think in terms of the shift, when did the shift start happening? It happened in, okay, so let me back up. The thing is, at the time I was not a citizen. I still had like a visa, and medical school, I don't know how it is now, but at the time it was very competitive if you weren't a resident or a citizen. So even, and also my grades, I had like a B, and I know that for medical school they want A's. So already I didn't have straight A's, and I was not a citizen. So the reality just came to, was like, okay, maybe medical school is not in the cards for me.
Maybe that was the explanation you gave your parents, but deep down you knew you loved your research.
True. And I was like, but this is very convenient, because actually I don't think that was even for me anymore. So that's the way that chapter closed, to be quite serious. And so then I took now this job as in the structure lab, and there they were interested in antiviral and antifungal targets. And again, for me, I was so fascinated. Then, but I remember at the time, one thing that I was thinking about in the back of my mind is, it's really cool to study these proteins by themselves, because what we do is you purify the protein biochemically, and then you crystallize it, meaning it's in this structure, in this like crystal form, and then you can elucidate the structure using X-rays and using diffraction. But what's really cool about this technique is that you can see the structure of the protein like at the atom level, angstrom resolution. It's excellent. But the reality is that inside the cell, the proteins are not just hanging out by themselves in this way. So I think at that time is where I started to think, okay, this is very cool, but I don't know that I want to do this forever, because I have that, there's that limitation. So then I told myself, okay, the next job that you get, try and find a job that tries to like maintain the realness of the way the proteins function. And so then after 2 years, now that professor retired. So then I was again on the job market, and I was like, okay, wherever you go, find a lab where they are looking at these proteins, but in a more realistic context. So I found a job in a biochemistry lab where they were also purifying proteins, but they were not purifying them and doing the same thing with them. What they were doing is they were purifying this macromolecular complex, and they were kind of doing activity assays with now this protein. And I thought that was so fascinating. So I applied for that job and I got that job. And that job was challenging for 2 reasons. The first is that they are working with this ginormous complex and asking these biochemical questions, but also because I got administrative responsibilities. And so now for the first time, I was working more closely with people, with students, and really trying to understand like what this job is, what it entails, what we are doing here. Because at the time I was very focused on my experiments, in that I was like, all I need to do is do my experiments, and I just have to push myself to the best of my ability, and that's it. Then now in this, so to answer your question, when did I decide PhD? It was now in this second job where I was working more closely with these students, and they really challenged me to think about now my career, because they were like, you should consider grad school. And at the time it hadn't occurred to me to consider grad school, and it hadn't really occurred to me that I could do it. Like I remember just being like, what do you mean? And they were like, yeah, you should consider. And so there was 3 of them. And what's really interesting about these 3 people is that they were so smart and just so human and so kind. And I remember they were and then also the other unique thing is that they were very interested in making sure that like I figured out the next step of my career, which I think was a first, because even though I'd had like a lot of cool bosses and cool mentors, they were mostly concerned with like, okay, what are we working on here? Let's do it to our best. But these 3, they were very much like, now what are you doing after here? And like, why aren't you going to grad school? Like what? So they were the ones who I think really shook up my career model. Because again, my career model was, I have a salary, I have healthcare benefits, I have a retirement that's being built. This is a good place now to start like building up myself. Like what more could I need? And I think for a first gen person, that is a lot, because my parents had moved here. They moved here in 2000 to start afresh. Like both my parents switched their professions, they switched everything. So the fact that I had like a stable job, I remember thinking like, what else now? Who am I now to actually say I need to switch or I need to do different? Like, so that was very conceptually challenging for me. And that's why I didn't do anything about it, because I was like, why would I need to change? But anyway, but they were these three people, Shamika, Kirby, and Ho Ching, they were very big on like, okay, what is the next step? And consider graduate school. And I remember Ho Ching was so committed to this that he volunteered to help me prepare for graduate school. And he proofread my essays, he provided feedback and context. And I also remember,
and these were grad students.
They were grad students. And also, this was the first time I met a Black graduate student, because one of them was an African-American, or is an African-American woman. And I remember that she was the first Black student I'd met here at UT. So I think the three of them, this is a very long answer to your question, but like what made me pivot, I think it was them being like, okay, this is great, but there's still space for you to grow. And I think they really challenged and shaped that season of my life. I will say, so now we are at like 2015. I will say also in 2015, I was really challenging my being in science, because I remember thinking, there's not many people that look like me. This is a very hard job. This is not easy. There's not many people that look like me. Like, why do I need to be here again? And I remember even thinking, maybe before, because remember, they were really influential in my perception. But even I still even challenged their perception, because I remember thinking, you seem to have a lot of ambition for someone else, and I don't understand why you're so excited about me pushing myself in a different direction. Maybe what I need to do is just leave for a while. So I quit my job. My job, the one that has a salary and retirement and everything. And healthcare. I quit. And I was like, we just need to go. And so I quit. And I went to work as a cashier at Target. That's where I went. Because I was like, we need to think about what is all this? And I just need a basic job that can like fulfill my basic needs, and that will allow me to like really seriously think about this world of science, and do I want to spend time in it, and what does it even mean to be in it? Because also, for background, I come from a very religious like background, so even the idea of wanting to be a scientist is also like there's just a lot of like, what the heck. Yeah, sorry, like going so fast.
You enjoyed your science.
A lot.
The only time you decided to quit and go work at Target was when people were convincing you to go to grad school.
Yes, because I was like, for what? To do what there? They're like, well, what are you doing here? And I was like, doing my science. What are you doing? Like, what do you mean? And like, I think that whole time I was just like, again, this job comes, it's like stable. Why are we changing things up? And they are just like, why are you not changing things up? So I feel like in this whole like milieu of things, I was like, just gotta go for a while. So yeah, I left. And I remember I told my boss, and he was like, you're going where? And I was like, to decide whether I need to be here anymore. And he was like, okay, good luck. But I remember even he was just like, huh? But that's what I did, and that's where I went. And in that time, I realized I missed it, and I really enjoyed it. Okay. So now I was like, okay, let's now try and figure this out. And so when I applied for grad school, and I think I applied to 5 in total, and I got into 4, and one of them was here.
This is so interesting. So the break you took was for how long?
It was for 1 year. Oh, it was like September to June, so I guess 9 months. Okay.
So you took the break. During the break, that way you found out, okay, yes, I really liked what I was doing. Scientists can work in industries with bachelors. But did you know that career existed?
I knew it existed vaguely, and the only reason I knew it was in the context of my graduate student colleagues, because they were thinking about what do I do after my PhD, and none of them wanted to go the professor route, so they were all thinking about industry positions. So I knew that such a thing existed, but it didn't occur to me that I needed to apply to it again, where I'm just like, what? But again, I think it's my mentality was, why are we changing up a good thing that so many people don't have, right? Because the idea of having a position that is salaried, that's a really big privilege that I think many people don't get until fairly late. And I think from my context and my background, that was a big deal. because my parents didn't have that type of opportunity. Because when they came here, like they spent a lot of time doing gig positions. And so the idea of stability for me was, I think, a really big anchor point. I think that was the thing, is I was like, I'm in a stable position. Why would I be exploring something else?
Okay, then you did your PhD. For me, I guess as a research scientist, right, I feel like you almost know everything. Like you're the one even helping the grad students, right? So you go and get a PhD. Was it a breeze for you then? Because you already had so much knowledge.
It was anything but a breeze. In fact, everything took a sharp left for me, because I think the mentality with which I started a PhD was shaped by my experiences. And my experiences were, you will figure it out. Just do it. You'll figure it out. And because I had worked always in concert with other people, I always had like the feedback from other people and perspective from other people. But the thing that I think the PhD journey did for me was it started to put me in a situation where I had to learn how to make my own calls. And that was an area where I hadn't developed a lot in. And so actually I switched labs in the middle of my PhD, actually, because the first place I tried to train in, there was this dissonance between exactly what you pointed out. You have so much experience, you're on 5 papers in 5 years, you clearly know how to figure out bed work. So the professor, I think, now looking back, I have not talked to them, so I don't know, but if I were to predict, is their perspective was, this person is coming with a lot of experience, they will figure it out. But I think I know my Achilles heel was that I was not very good at making calls on my own in terms of navigating experiments and knowing when to pivot from them. And this is actually a reason, when I sat down and let me back up. When I was trying to decide, okay, do I really want to do this PhD and what will I get from it? One of the things that I wanted to develop was the ability to design my own experiments and the ability to know how to pivot from certain experimental approaches, and also the ability to learn how to tell a science story. That was the reason why when I look, I do remember doing this calculation, because I remember wondering, because first of all, it's like you're putting yourself in a more stressful environment with very specific requirements and a lot of uncertainty. And I remember thinking, like, why are you choosing now to sign up? Yes, these people are encouraging you to think about the future, but why PhD and why not another job? And I sat down and I wrote it down, and that was one of the things, is that I didn't have a good sense of designing experiments and like doing a good cost-benefit analysis, because all the work I had done before, someone else is telling me, okay, this is our experimental hypothesis, these are the experiments we're going to do, you need to do X, Y, Z. And then I would do X, Y, Z, and I would do it well, or I would fail and know to be like, okay, we need to go back to X. And so it was always in a container. And I remember thinking, I know experimental life is not this safe, so I have to figure out a way to develop the skills to kind of go to the next so-called level. And the only way to do that is in a PhD context, because even if I go to industry, I'm going to be working with a team and someone else is going to be calling the shots, you know? And so I don't know that I'll develop those skills, those specific skills. So that was the why. I thought that was my why of, okay, bite this bullet and do this. And then my first PhD experience, that was my Achilles heel, because I walked into it thinking, I have the curiosity, I have the excitement, I have the capacity, and I'd also won a really prestigious fellowship, which really helped with my confidence. And it covered my research for 3 years, which is and it was it was the NSF GRFP. So I was floating on air. I was like, I got this. But my Achilles heel was the inability to look at an experimental approach and think, it's not just about hard work, it's also about strategy, and it's also about thinking about the limits of this experimental setup. Like, what are the limits of detection of this experimental assay? Why are you doing it this way? And then being able to interpret the results outside of my own failure. Those were my Achilles heels. Those had not been developed before, because my approach before was, you're given a very specific amount of work and you just do it. So that requires hard work to do it. So my hard work muscles were very strong. And
so you're experimental, you knew how to run a lot of experiments and use the machines.
And do the things.
But you didn't know how to sit down and be like, okay, I want to do this. How do I move this along the pipeline? Why am I doing this?
And when do you stop and when do you pivot? Because prior to that, stop was only if something failed. stop was not when something failed, but it's like something I can figure. So it's a mistake that I have made. That was when I knew to stop. But what I didn't realize is that sometimes stop is because your experimental setup is wrong. Sometimes stop is because you're outside of the limits of detection. Sometimes stop is because this approach actually has too many false outcomes and is not a robust experimental assay. That is really important, and that muscle was very weak because my strategy was I will work hard my way through everything. But that's not a strategy. That is not a strategy. That is not an experimental strategy. It will lead you to problems because you will waste time, you will waste reagents, you will waste a lot of your effort, and also people have limited amounts of patience and resources, right? So that I think was my Achilles heel, and that was the thing that I wanted to develop and which took me a really long time to develop.
Okay, so when you say it took you a really long time, like at what point in your PhD year did you feel like, okay, I know what I'm doing, I know how to run this, I know how to do this, I've achieved this that I came into the PhD for?
It took me a while because I took the hit of leaving my first lab because I was not able to perform at the rate that
And you were there for 1 year?
2 years. I was there for 2 years. 2.5, I think. I started in June of 2017 and I left September of 2019.
So you pivoted fast though.
Yeah, that's not fast. That's 2 years is a long time.
Okay, so how long was your PhD?
Oh, so it went from 2019 to September of 2022.
Which is?
Almost 3 years. But I mean, I think...
So wait, sorry. Your last year was in a different lab?
My last... Because, okay, so I entered the program in 2016. In our program, at the time, you did 1 year of rotations. And this was just to help you figure out, like, what lab do you belong in, where should you go, and who has money for you. Okay. So then you join and you sign the papers June 2017. Okay. So I signed the papers in June 2017 for lab number 1. Okay. And by September 2019, I was out.
Okay. So but I guess what I'm saying you pivoted is because some people stay in one lab and still finish a PhD in 5 years. You went to a different lab and finished in 3 years. I would have thought that would have added more 5 years.
But I think now to answer your question, I took a really big hit in confidence. But I also gained a lot in competence from the failure of the first experience. Okay. So I think that even if it was a really challenging experience, I think it gave me the opportunity to go back and think about this idea of like, okay, the responsibility is on you to develop the skills to know when something is working versus not, and to define really nicely what you're trying to get out of this. And I think that is a tool that helped me a lot. That and an amazing advisor. I have to give my advisor credit for really providing the environment for me to hone that. And so I think throughout my 6 years of my PhD, I grew a lot. Like from June of, when did we even start? From the summer of 2016, that was the start. And to 2022 September, I grew a lot. Even though my path wasn't linear, and even though I don't know if you've seen that picture of like this scribble, yes. Like I was definitely scribble syndrome, but I grew a lot in terms of learning those skills, like learning how to do an experiment and define the boundaries and define the limits, because that was a place that I failed so much in. I think I was able to develop that, and I think that helped me be a better experimentalist overall. I don't know if that answered the question.
No, that definitely answered the question. And so now you're doing your postdoc. So you finished your PhD. Why did you decide to continue with a postdoc and not just like go work in the industry at that point?
The reason I chose to stay on is for 2 reasons. The first, because I realized that I still wanted to develop a couple of more experimental skills in my PhD lab context. And then the second has to do with a new chapter that opened up for me during the time of COVID. So during COVID, I think we're talking the summer of 2020, one thing that became extremely apparent to me was this idea that like a lot of the science that we do in the lab environment doesn't necessarily get kind of integrated into the way that people think. and into the way that different societies integrate science. This was especially clear to me in the context of like Kikuyu language television. My family is from the ethnic community called Kikuyu people in Kenya, and one thing I was wondering in the time of COVID was how a lot of the discoveries that were being developed, how are those being translated into communities where people don't speak English? And what I learned from consuming some of that content was that there was a lot of perspectives of disease and perspectives of pandemic and perspective of COVID specifically that was not informed by what I was learning about by reading about the COVID, even the COVID vaccine development. Like that whole process was not being translated. So I started to think about, okay, what would it look like to spend some time doing some translation and working with people to develop these resources? And so I started to do that. And that really kind of added an extra layer to my scientific identity in terms of took on this responsibility of also teaching, not in English, about science. And so I was really privileged to have an advisor who really supported that and who supports that. And so she's given me kind of some freedom to really explore and grow that. And so to answer your question, the reason I stayed on as a postdoc is for those two reasons. Number one, to develop some extra skills that I think are really important. And number two, to develop this project and this idea of translating science into my mother tongue.
Could you throw a little more light on the translation effects? Are you just translating for like TV stations or radio stations, or are you translating for print media, or are you translating to people to translate to people?
So the idea is that the translations that I'm doing are for people to talk with other people. So I'm doing a translation in terms of like teaching the concept, and then also trying to do it in a way that's accessible for other people to dialogue with others about it.
Okay.
So I do this on YouTube, and the strategy is to make like a short YouTube video about a concept and then make it in such a way that people can dialogue about it and or ask questions without having a science background. So that's the rationale.
Yeah, but something else I haven't thought about is like a young girl, maybe somewhere in Kenya, that might not be able to speak English because of, I mean, I'm African, so I know there are some areas, like in my village, you walk the streets and you're speaking English and people are looking at you, you're speaking my language, right? But it doesn't mean there's no one person, there might be that one child that likes experiments, for instance. But because there's a disconnect between the English and the experiment, they just end up doing experiments the way they know how to do experiments or whatever they want to do, right? Because, for instance, I see some kids develop, like somewhere in Africa, I will see someone build a car. It's like no one told him anything about building it. He just took some sticks and did some things together, right? But now being able to teach that young girl in that language more, then it even makes her sharper and know more about like, okay, so actually this thing I'm doing is not just for fun or whatever. It's actually something that can become a job, and it's actually something that can impact public health. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, and it's actually so fascinating that you say that, because just last week I was in Kenya and I was in the village and I was talking, is it a village or like a town? I was in the rural parts of Kenya where my grandparents are, and I was talking with a teacher, and this is a teacher of biology, and he's the head of science at his secondary school. He teaches physics, but he's responsible for physics, chemistry, and biology. And even he, in 2025, was saying that many of his students, they think in Kikuyu, but then they learn in English, and so they have to do translation back and forth. They themselves have to do it.
Yes.
And that's like a really big ask, right? Because you're asking kids who are learning to translate.
Yes.
But like, I have a PhD, I can translate for you so that you don't have to do all that.
Yeah.
So that's another reason why. And so I was talking with him about this, and he was like, yeah, this is great, because it helps kind of minimize this,
the barriers,
the barriers and also the burden, right? Because like in my training experience with the advisor that I trained under, a really, really big component of training in that lab environment is learning how to teach. I mean, I'm not a perfect teacher by any means, but I have been trained how to teach biology, even though I don't have like certifications. But I mean, that was part of my PhD experience in my lab. So which is, I think, something that for me kind of increased the burden because I remember in 2020 thinking, here I am being taught how to teach, because in addition to doing experiments, we are taught how to teach in our lab, right? So I remember thinking, here I am being taught how to teach, but my grandparents are learning about COVID and SARS-CoV-2 from these strange YouTube videos that are communicating this communication. Like, that doesn't make sense. And that was like really the driver. And then my interaction last week was a reminder of that. You know, there's a lot of people who have to live this way. And I think UNESCO did a study that said 40% of people learning around the world do it in a language that they don't understand.
Yeah.
So I think between like your example and this conversation I had just last week, yes, there's an importance of translating and also just reducing the burden on young kids, because they shouldn't have to do all that back and forth. Adults, yes, but I also think adults have developed more language capacity. So I think adults can do it. I don't think children should have to.
Okay, speaking of cultural identity, can you tell me how your cultural identity has shaped your whole PhD postdoc journey in any way?
I mean, okay, I would say that my identity as an immigrant has shaped the whole hard work thing, hard work over everything. Because when I think about, I mentioned how like I think my biggest weakness was this idea that I could work my way through everything instead of like
outwork.
Outwork. So you can't outwork. You have to also be really strategic and really smart about pivoting and stopping. So I think that is a really big strength, but also that was a really big weakness of mine. So I think that is something that came from the immigrant mindset. And even I think Kenyan people work really, really hard also. Like there's this idea of like this really strong grind culture. I think I can say all immigrants have this because usually we have to build from scratch, right? So I think that my immigrant background definitely shaped that perspective and that kind of orientation, which I have learned is not the way to do everything. And I think my PhD journey was a really big part of teaching me that. So I think that's probably my biggest thing.
Has there been any point you felt like maybe I shouldn't be here?
Yes.
Just because of your background as an immigrant?
Yeah, this is why I went to work at Target, because I remember thinking, what the heck? What am I doing here? Because the thing is, there's not many people that look like me here. I don't have like a template in terms of I can go talk to this person about their experiences, because oftentimes they don't have my experience and they don't understand how it is to walk the path that I have walked. So for the longest time, my perspective was maybe this means I shouldn't be here. Like there's a reason there's no precedent, and there's a reason there's not many examples. And so I think that is something that has shaped my path a lot. But then more recently, I think I've pivoted away from that, because I recognize we all have our own different paths, and our commitment, I think, or at least my commitment, is to try and walk my path the best I can. And that I think is a sufficient contribution to make in my life, I think, is honoring the fact that my life has its own path, and I don't necessarily have to pattern myself against some. I think I do have to be intentional about finding resources to help me, because I don't know everything, but I don't necessarily have to pattern myself after everything.
Okay, so speaking about questioning your right decision, right? You said this was before you went to do your PhD. During your PhD years, have you ever sat down and questioned, do I really need to be here?
Yes.
And what moments made you question that? What did you do to like get out of that as well?
I would say, so my first lab that I was in, I think that being there was a blessing and a curse. I think it was a blessing because I think it's the place in which I grew the most. And it's a curse because it was a very painful growth process. Because I think that in that environment is where I learned it's not all just about working hard, is you also have to work smart. And most importantly, there are some environments that are simply not for you. And it's your responsibility to be really honest about that. And you can't outwork an environment that doesn't work for you. And so I think in that process in which I was learning all of those things, I remember wondering, is this a sign that I don't need to be here? I mean, because clearly this environment, this training method, this training system I like the topic, but the concepts, I didn't have the adequate background to meaningfully contribute to them. And I thought I could work really hard and gain that understanding, but I couldn't and I didn't. And so I remember in that moment wondering, is this a sign that I just need to go elsewhere and go back to Target and try and go the corporate? Because at the time I had thought I would go into like corporate sales or like work, switch entirely. And I remember thinking, do I need to try and go and do that? Like, what is this? But I think I realized that I care a lot about discovery and experiments and the growth opportunities that I have gotten from being an experimental research scientist. And I remember thinking, you know, when you came to graduate school, you were really concerned with learning how to do experiments well and learning how to lead your way through experiments. You have failed in this context because I had specific responsibilities that I did not achieve and specific experimental like goals that I didn't do well. So I remember in that moment thinking, isn't this what you want? Like, you wanted to be given responsibility for an experiment. You wanted to learn how to fail. What you didn't know was that that would lead to you leaving the lab entirely, or that the consequence of this inability to do this experiment, you thought that the consequence would be growing and being allowed to try again. But another consequence is growing and being told this is no longer for you, right? So I remember in that moment thinking, but does the fact that that this process has ended, does this mean I need to go, or does this mean I need to try again? And so I think learning how to determine between like stop versus try again, and asking myself like, what are the whys? Why am I here? What am I here for? What is this degree for? Like, learning how to do that was really important.
Thank you so much. This is where I want to ask your advice. You were able to transition to a different lab. Some students either do one of two things. They either quit completely or they just get a master's and leave. But you were able to transition to other labs. And I feel like I've spoken to some people and I've asked them, okay, why don't you just transition? And they're like, it's not that easy. It's like this all professors are all friends. Like, how do I go to a different professor and be like, take me? This person, no matter how we try to sever the relationship in the best way we can, this person is still going to be like, I was a bad student. I'm going to be like, he was a bad advisor, right? So how do you talk to those students to navigate those kind of situations?
So that's tough. I will say that for me, I had the blessing of the fact that I had my own funding. So then I was able to say, I'm on this grant that covers me for 6 months. Would you take me on as a trial? So it was like, I had that privilege because I left my first lab with 6 months of funding left. So that's what I used to pivot to the next lab. If I were to give broad advice, what I would say is, it's true. All the professors are friends. So the first thing to do is to kind of divorce yourself entirely from talking about direct professors with their peers, because we are their students. They are each other's peers, right? That's the first thing. And the odds that another professor will be on your side against another professor are zero. So I think just like knowing that is important. Then the second thing is really thinking about like why it didn't work. Like, why didn't that relational, like, okay, yes, I know that there's human dynamics, like everyone has a personality, they all have their own things. But if you kind of like if you try and like divide all that up into discrete units, if you focus on the part of the experiment or of the lab work, like, why did it not work? Is it that you didn't get the right mentorship, meaning the professor wasn't paying attention? Is it that you were not yourself paying attention to the experiments in terms of taking ownership over like the progress or the advancements or the bounds of the experiment? Like, what is your responsibility because whenever there's two people that are part of the relational dynamic, and we have to take responsibility over our part. Like, we can't take responsibility over their part. That's not us. But we can still take responsibility over us. What did we do or didn't do in this context? Not to blame. I am not blaming. The burden of the relational dynamic is on the advisor, right? Because they are the advisor. So I'm not trying to blame the person on the student side. What I'm trying to think about is, how can we empower the student to take ownership of their experience and then use that to pivot to the next experience? And so sometimes that can look like sitting down and thinking about why. Like, why are you in a PhD program? So for me, I sat down and I thought, okay, why am I in a PhD program? Why did I go to that lab in the first place? In my case, I went to that lab. When I started the PhD program, I knew I want to learn how to do a specific technique, and I want to be able to apply this for infectious disease. That was my why for coming to this university and for studying a PhD. And in terms of the skills I wanted to develop how to run my own experiments and troubleshoot and optimize and all that. So when the first research lab didn't work, which I had picked based on technique, I went back to the drawing board and I thought, why else did you come here? Because you wanted to learn how to understand infectious disease. Who are the infectious disease professors in this university? Okay, these are them. Okay, look at their experiments, look at their papers. Where do you think you might be able to learn and grow? And where do you think you can be able to use the techniques that you got from place number A now to place number B? And that's how I approached it. So I think if I were talking to myself in 2019, that I would say the same thing. I would say, okay, you didn't come to this university because of this person. You came here because you had very specific goals. Your goals were to learn how to do advanced microscopy. Your goals were to learn how to understand an infectious disease. Where are we on those goals? Okay, your microscopy experience didn't work out, but why didn't it work out? Because of X, Y, Z. Okay, so don't repeat that. And so I think learning how to dissect and rebuild, and then using that to help guide you to the next place. So that's what I would
So
mind.
just to touch on it a little bit more, when you reached out to the new professors, did the conversation come up of why are you leaving this other place?
Don't think she asked me that. I think what I did is I told her I hadn't been making sufficient progress in the former lab, which is true. I was not, and it wasn't meeting my goals or my aims, which is also true.
Okay.
So
you hadn't, so leaving this first lab, you hadn't started working on your dissertation.
So in the STEM fields, it's a bit different because when you start, you're almost always doing something towards your dissertation progress. Because usually what you do is you're assigned to be part of a specific project. And then depending on now how that goes, that's what you then expand out into your dissertation. So from the time you walk in, you're doing something towards your dissertation in one way or other.
I guess what I'm asking is, okay, because the way some departments work is they have like M1, M2, right? So were you still able to carry on your research from that lab into your dissertation?
No, stop. Everything stopped. It ended.
Okay.
And then in October 2019, I started afresh, and that's what I defended in September of 2022.
So everything was completely new.
Everything was entirely brand new. I carried nothing over.
So I guess that's a decision some people have to make, which is hard because if you're gonna drop everything you've done for 2 years, right? That's why I say you were still smart and lucky because you were able to pivot and still get out of there in 3 years, right? But I don't think everybody has that privilege because it might take them another 4-5 years if they have to start all over again. So at least thank you for that.
Yeah, I think in that context, what I would do is like say that in the conversation, like when you're going, I think, to the new environment, it helps to ask like what type of projects are like does your lab have? Like if the next person is willing to take you on, like asking outright what type of projects do they have, and then asking yourself what can I bring with me from my old training environment? Because I mean you're the one who did those experiments, so you have the expertise. And so then the question becomes, okay, what can you take from, because there's no such thing as wasted time in my mindset, right? I think as long as you're breathing and standing upright, you've not wasted time. You've only wasted time if you are like not intentional about what you're doing, right? So when you walk into the new lab, you still have all this knowledge that you've been working on in the last 2 years. You may not take the project, you can take the techniques, you can take your mistakes, because your mistakes also teach you a lot. So I think that is something that is really that was helpful for me in my pivot. I do understand that it is true that not everyone has that opportunity, but I think if you go back to the drawing board of asking yourself why PhD, and the answer is still that you want to do the PhD, then you will keep moving forward. And that might mean switching schools, which is terrible because that might mean another prelim exam. But I think that if you really want the degree for your specific aim that you have, like, and that's not something I can tell you, like that's something that the person decides. If you still want to get your PhD, the world is your oyster, like not in a naive way, but in like a, you can still do it. It's just that it takes a very specific amount of intention and like clarity.
So speaking of support, what role has faith, community played in helping you sustain yourself throughout all of this process?
How would I say? I think my faith system, so for context, I was raised in a Christian context, and I think that helped a lot to orient me towards like opportunity still being available and doors always being present for me to walk in and explore. So I think that helped to orient me a lot. My faith community, I had a terrible experience with church in grad school. So I don't think I can claim like a church context, like a church community necessarily, but I can cite this idea of there being a plan and there being like hope. Like there's always hope. If you are still standing, there is hope. It just might look different than how you started. You might have started with the intention of, in 5 years, I will have this degree and 4 papers, but then life goes differently, your experiences go differently. But if you still have it in your heart, if God has placed it in your heart, or if like you still have this intention, like that is sufficient to keep going. It just requires you to use your resources differently and build. I think I would say that the one thing that my unique combination of support and life experiences has helped me curate is the ability that I still have the opportunity to build regardless of where I am. So even when my experience ended in 2019, when I had to pivot labs, the onus was still on me to build and to think, okay, so this has crumbled. Do we still want to build again? Yes. Okay. So then where are the bricks? So then start building again. And I think that mindset came from, I think, maybe my faith background, even though I can't claim a church home, but I think that context, that cultural context helped me have that like general orientation.
But then in terms of community, it doesn't have to be church. Like your parents, your friends, did you have community from that aspect? Like a support system or even mentors?
I think so my parents have always, so they're in Austin and they're the reason I chose to come to UT Austin, because I remember, I don't know if this was me foretelling, but I've heard so many horror stories about PhDs that I remember when I was making my choice, I remember thinking, please pick the one in Austin, because if this goes left, at least you can go stay with your parents. Like that is the reason I picked you.
Thanks for saying that about the horror stories.
That's all I'd heard. Like other than, because even I mentioned my 3 mentors who were the grad students, even they had terrible stories, even as they were mentoring me through, right? Because I remember thinking, all y'all have is negative things to say about this experience that you're telling me to enter.
Yeah.
And I remember one of the mentors, the one who was helping me through the graduate school application, he always joked that PhD stood for permanent head damage, which looking back, I'm like, so then why were you mentoring me to enter this nonsense? Like what? So I don't know, I will leave that there. But I think the reason I picked Austin is because I remember thinking, okay, so now if we're willingly choosing permanent head damage, imagine, let's pick the place where my parents are 30 minutes away so I can go there if everything falls apart. So that was that. So I think having my parents close by was helpful. Also, like my cohort, I had a few friends that I think they all had their own struggles, but they were really focused on finishing and focused on making things work. So I had one friend who, she actually had her baby, I think, within 6 months of her dissertation defense. And so like watching her focus and watching her like prioritize like her family, her health, and her dissertation at the same time was, for me, I remember thinking, okay, so here's a model of someone who has shown you how it is to like number 1, focus on the things that matter, and number 2, execute and succeed. So I had that. I also had another friend who had a really tough experience in her PhD lab, but she really wanted her degree. And so then I remember her approach was building her community and her friends and like seeing a therapist and getting medication, spending time like really watering the things that she loved. So she was someone who was very focused on like community projects. So she always had community projects. So I remember watching her, like seeing, okay, she still wants this degree, but this is how she executes it, is she prioritizes all the other things in order to help her. So I think I had those people like around me. I also had another friend who, he also switched out of labs in a similar way that I did, and he ended up being like he ended up getting like an amazing paper, and he loved his second lab. And I remember what I learned from him was he had a really good way of just being like, okay, that was the past, the future is here, and I am loving it. Like he had 10 out of 10 experience. He loved it so much. And his mentor and him were very close, I think they're still pretty close. Watching him like really step into this new lab and the new techniques and technologies that they developed, that was really cool, because I remember that being like a lesson that like you can still rebuild. So with this idea of like rebuilding, he showed me that you can rebuild and like build bigger, because the lab that he ended up in, that paper I think was bigger than all the other ones that he could have gotten, and the topic was bigger than any of the other than the topic that he was working on in his prior lab. And the experiences that he had were bigger, like, because he's someone who loves to travel, and I don't know, to this day I don't know how he did it, but every like 6 months he would travel outside the continent.
Oh wow.
Like, so outside North America, there he is, all over the world. And he knew how to do that. And so I think I had those people in my life who really helped to orient me in like rebuilding and curating what's important. So I think those people really help.
Okay, so if your degree could speak to you now, what would it apologize to you for, and what would it thank you for?
Oh my gosh. Whoa, that is an amazing question. What would it apologize? What would it thank me for and apologize? I think, so my topic was very funny actually, and I laugh about this topic a lot because I am someone who used to get stressed out a lot. I don't get stressed out as much, but the topic that I studied for my PhD was studying the stress response in bacteria and understanding how that kind of overlaps with the way that they make us sick. And so my bacteria of interest, it gives you stomach issues and diarrhea and dysentery. But what's really cool about it is that in order to get into your gut, it has to go through your mouth, into your stomach, like into all these different chemical contexts. And they adapt to all of those different chemical contexts and make it to your gut where they kill the cells and give you dysentery. But the cool thing about that is that from learning and thinking about that, it reminded me that we can also adapt to all sorts of different environments, right? So I think that that's what, I mean, the degree, that's probably what it would remind me, that like bacteria who have been here way before humans were have developed they have many abilities to adjust to stress. This is just one of them, but like they use that to help them deal with everything. So I think that if there's one thing my degree would tell me is to remember that like organisms millions of years older than humans, this is how they adapt to different environments. Like they adapt, that's the word, is they have a stress response that helps them adapt. And in the same way, even though I am not a bacterium, I still can take some of these conceptual lessons to adapt and to adjust and to adapt instead of folding and crashing. So that's what it would tell me. And then the second question was, what would it thank me for? I think it may thank me for trying again, for resilience, and for trying again, and for like just being really excited about it. Like, because it took me a while to get excited because this stress response is very well characterized in many, many bacteria. So I remember thinking, oh my gosh, this particular stress response is really well known. And so here I am characterizing it in yet another bacteria. Like that's not necessarily like unique, but it is unique because it hasn't been done before. And it's like a unique organism and a unique system. So I think that it would thank me for not dismissing the concept and for learning that each species of bacteria has its own story, and there's overlap in terms of their similarity, but they're all different. So I think it would thank me for finally getting that through my head, and now I'm really excited. Yes.
How do you measure the value of everything that you have gone through?
That is whoa, you have like come in with these questions. How do I measure the value? I think in the fact that I am still here and I'm happy about it. Like, so that's how I would measure it. The fact that I have grown, me as a person, because I can tell you I have grown a lot as a person from 2016 when I walked through graduate school. Like, I think it was June? Because I chose to start in the summer. Why? I don't know. But I did like the summer rotation because I was doing too much. I was really just doing too much.
Grace emailing 30 professors.
I don't know, at like the age of 20, who asked for all that? But like there I was. Yeah, I've also stopped doing too much. At least I've learned. See, I've learned so much. Stop doing too much. Doing the most. So I think I would say the growth. The value is in the growth. And the fact that you can say that there's many cheaper traumatic ways to grow, which is true. But also I think that this has been like a unique growth opportunity for me as an individual. And I treasure that and I honor that. And I am really glad I went through all that, even with the traumatic experiences of the start of my PhD. They still like helped me grow a lot. And so I'm now really grateful for the opportunity that God gave me to go through all that. Not in like there's those people that like they love to glorify trauma and suffering. This is not that. I will tell you, I struggled and it was terrible. And also I grew a lot. I wish I didn't have to struggle so much, but actually no, but I wish I didn't have to struggle so much, period. And I grew a lot. So I think the value is just in the growth and the fact that I'm here smiling and still really excited to be here, even though there's many reasons not to be.
Thanks for all your advice. So we like to end our interviews with a rapid fire question.
Oh my
Where
word,
we ask
okay.
you 3 questions and you give us the first response, not thinking too much about it. So from the numbers 1 to 10, can you pick 3 numbers?
8, 2, and 5.
Grace went from 8 to 2 to 5. You see, you think completely different. Every other person will be like 2, 5, 8, or 8, 5, 2. But 8, Grace is like, I'm gonna switch it all up. So number 8, is academia toxic or just misunderstood?
Oh, again, you have excellent questions. I don't think it's any more toxic than all the other industries. I think that it curates for a very specific type of person for whom certain things are harder than others, and that makes for a very specific environment. Because I think I've heard a lot of critiques of people like in corporate, and a lot of critiques of people who are like in law firms and in these tax firms and in these Wall Street and in these management consulting businesses,
yes.
and then even like of teachers, like, you know, the problems that they have with their administrators,
Yes.
nurses, the problems they have with their, like with the doctors and with the surgeons and with the billing people and with the patients. I don't know. So I feel like I don't know that there's any place that like doesn't have toxic, problematic behavior.
Fun fact, I'll go to your other 2 questions, but fun fact, I had this during my pharmacist year. I had this person that left teaching to come be a pharmacist. Then he got into pharmacy and he was like, okay, this is just as toxic as teaching. Basically, he's now back to teaching, but teaching like in a higher sense, like he's back to like curriculum planning and all that. But I'm like, it's so funny that you're back to where you left. Okay, but that was 8. So now let me go to number 2. What is the biggest lie you told yourself to keep going?
Biggest lie, that if I work hard, it will all be figured out. That's not true.
So number 5, what's one thing you can't say in a funding application, but you wish you could say?
One thing that I would say one thing I can't say that I wish.
Something you can't like write in when you're writing for grants or funding. Something you can't write, but you wish you could write it.
Please fund me, fund me, underline, highlight. You will not regret it, because I will make sure we will find one thing. It may not be towards like a vaccine development or towards this like mind-blowing thing, but we will learn one thing, which I know is not great, because usually like there's supposed to be a goal, or there's supposed to be like something that can be monetized or built upon. And sometimes knowledge is cool just for the sake of knowledge. But maybe that's what I would say. I would say, please remember, knowledge is cool for the sake of knowledge. It doesn't have to be this grand.
I know this grandiose.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be grandiose. Just, did we know it before? No. Do we know it now? Yes. Check. Which we'll never see. And you can't write that in a grant, because they will just be like, what do you think this is?
Thank you so much. We're so happy to have had you on here. And I'm sure so much of your conversations will be like appreciated by a lot of people.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. It was so fun.